Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a slightly different path. We're looking at how the modern world came to be. Not through the usual stories of factories and cities, but actually through the experiences of people often left out of that narrative, the forest dwellers, the pastoralists, especially around the 19th century. Yeah, we've gathered this really fascinating collection of sources, specific historical facts, community records, and our goal is to weave them together to tell a bigger story about conflict, about resources, and profound environmental shifts. Okay, let's unpack this crucial hidden history.
Absolutely. And it's crucial because to really grasp, the global economy today, you can't just look at the big industrial centers. You have to understand the massive environmental and cultural changes that underpin it all. And these communities, especially in places like India and across Africa, they're right at the heart of this story, even though, as you said, they often end up as just footnotes in the history books. So the starting point has to be the land itself, the forests, what happened. Our sources point to something pretty dramatic. Between 1700 and 1995, something like 9.3% of the entire world's forest cover was cleared.
Wow, nearly a tenth.
Exactly. But in India, this wasn't just gradual change. Under colonial rule, deforestation became, well, systematic. It was planned, extensive, driven by this new administrative mindset, and crucially, a huge global demand for timber.
Okay, systematic clearing. That phrase really jumps out. It suggests a demand that was way beyond just local needs, right? So what exactly created this explosion in demand for forest products back in the 19th century?
It was relentless, really, and coming from several directions. You had growing industries needing raw materials, expanding cities needing construction timber, and the constant demands of empire. Think about the Royal Navy.
Ah, the ships.
Yes. By the 1820s, England's own oak forests were largely gone. They needed durable timber for warships. So they literally sent search parties to India looking for wood suitable for the Navy.
That's amazing. The British Navy depending on Indian forests. But you mentioned something else was the real sort of industrial scale driver.
Railways. Definitely railways. The sheer infrastructural hunger of the British Empire, especially in India, was just enormous. And to build thousands upon thousands of kilometers of track, they needed wood, specifically for sleepers.
Sleepers, okay, those are the wooden planks under the rails holding them in place.
That's right, the ones laid across the track bed. And the quantity needed was just staggering.
How staggering are we talking? Like per mile of track?
Well, the estimates are somewhere between 1,760 and 2,000 sleepers for each mile of railway track.
For 1 mile.
For 1 mile. And this wasn't a small project. By 1890, India's railway network had already reached about 25,500 kilometers.
The scale is almost impossible to picture.
It really is. Just to give you one concrete example from the sources,
Yeah.
there was the Northern State Railway line from Lahore to Multan. Building just that one line needed an estimated 2.2 million sleepers.
2.2 million.
Yes. Think about the forests that represents. Extracting on that scale required more than just manpower. It demanded a whole new way for the colonial administration to look at and control the land.
So railways were the engine, but was it purely about transport? Or was there another motive maybe masked by this need for infrastructure?
Oh, definitely. It was intertwined with revenue. The colonial state fundamentally saw these vast, diverse forests as, quote, unproductive wilderness.
Unproductive.
Unproductive because they weren't generating direct cash revenue in the way, say, agriculture could. The view was that this land should be cleared and cultivated for commercial crops. Not for feeding local people, mind you, but for profit, for export.
Right, and that leads directly to the rise of plantations, doesn't it? Clearing huge areas of natural forest to grow things like tea, coffee, rubber.
Exactly, all destined for markets back in Europe. The forest essentially got converted from this complex ecosystem supporting local life into, well, a kind of single-product factory floor.
But managing that level of extraction, that conversion, couldn't have been chaotic. They must have needed some kind of system, some control.
They did. They devised an administrative system to manage it, to maximize the output. And they gave it a rather efficient-sounding name, scientific forestry.
Scientific forestry, okay.
And there's a key figure here, Dietrich Brandis, a German forester, actually, who was appointed the first Inspector General of Forests in India.
Brandis. So he's the architect of this new system.
He was certainly central. He set up the Indian Forest Service in 1864 and really implemented this formal system of, yes, scientific forestry.
Okay, here's where I think it gets really interesting, ecologically speaking, because scientific forestry sounds positive, rational, But what did it actually mean on the ground for the forests themselves?
It meant simplification, control, often at the expense of the forest's own health. You see, a natural forest has this incredible mix of different trees, plants, animals, all interacting.
Right, biodiversity.
Precisely. Scientific forestry aimed to replace that messy, diverse reality with neat, orderly plantations. Often just one type of tree planted in straight rows. Monoculture.
Monoculture. Easier to count, easier to harvest for timber, I suppose. But ecologically, much more fragile.
Exactly. It's incredibly vulnerable. If a particular pest or disease comes along that targets that one tree species, it can devastate the entire plantation. There's no natural resilience like you have in a diverse forest. Plus, the only thing that mattered was the timber value, usually specific trees like teak or sal. All the other plants and trees that local people relied on or that supported the ecosystem, they were basically seen as weeds, things to be cleared away.
And this whole approach was then locked into law.
Yes, with the Forest Act of 1878. This act formally divided forests into categories. Reserved forests, the most valuable, where local access was totally forbidden or heavily restricted, protected forests, and village forests. It essentially legislated people out of their own environment.
Which must have created an immediate, massive conflict. You have the forest department wanting neat rows of teak, and the villagers needing, well, everything else.
That's the absolute core of the conflict. For a villager, a good forest was a source of everything: food, fuel, fodder for their animals, medicines, materials for tools. They needed things like the Siati creeper to make ropes, or the fruit of the mahua tree for cooking oil and even alcohol. A whole mixture of things.
A living pantry and pharmacy.
Exactly. But for the forest department, the only thing that mattered was timber suitable for railways or ships. Everything else was, in their view, obstructing the growth of commercially valuable trees.
So how did this legal change, this new definition of the forest, actually impact the daily lives of people who lived in and around these forests for generations? What happened to them?
Well, overnight, their entire way of life was effectively criminalized. Things they had done for centuries, collecting firewood, grazing their cattle, gathering fruits or roots, suddenly became illegal activities under the Forest Act. They could be fined, punished, excluded.
And a really big casualty here was shifting cultivation, wasn't it? Known by different names like Jehum or Podu or Kumri, depending on the region.
Yes, European foresters absolutely hated shifting cultivation. They banned it wherever they could.
Why? What was their reasoning?
Two main reasons. First, they saw it as economically wasteful because the land wasn't producing valuable timber continuously. Trees were cut and burned to clear land for crops. Second, they were terrified of fire. The practice involves controlled burning, and they feared these fires could escape and destroy their precious timber plantations.
But wasn't shifting cultivation actually a sustainable practice in its traditional form?
It absolutely was, when practiced traditionally. The key was the long fallow period. Plots were cultivated for a few years, then left alone for maybe 12, sometimes up to 18 years. This allowed the forest to regenerate fully. The colonial system just didn't have the patience for that natural cycle. It wanted constant timber production.
And the consequences for the communities when this practice was banned?
Devastating. Many were forcibly displaced from their ancestral lands. Others were forced to completely change their occupations, perhaps becoming wage laborers for the forest department itself. And, critically, many communities resisted. They rebelled.
Is there an example of that, of people directly pushing back?
A very poignant one comes from the Baigas, a forest community in central India. In 1892, they actually sent a petition to the government. They stated quite plainly that they were starving because the ban on their traditional cultivation methods had made it impossible for them to survive. Their lives had been turned upside down.
Just heartbreaking. And the control wasn't just about the trees and the land, it extended to the animals too, right? Hunting became illegal.
Yes, traditional subsistence hunting by forest dwellers was banned. They were now labeled poachers if they hunted for food.
But paradoxically, the colonial officials themselves encouraged hunting of certain animals.
That's the strange contradiction. While locals couldn't hunt for food, British officials often engaged in large-scale sport hunting and actively encouraged the killing of large predators like tigers and wolves. There was even a reward system.
Why? What was the thinking behind targeting those specific animals?
It was partly about perceived danger, but there was also a deeper sort of political ideology at play. These large, wild animals were seen as symbols of a wild, untamed, primitive society. Officials genuinely seemed to believe that killing them off was part of the process of civilizing India, imposing order on nature itself.
That's a chilling justification, and the numbers involved were significant.
Immense. Just look at tigers. Between 1875 and 1925, the records show that rewards were paid for killing approximately 80,000 tigers.
80,000 tigers.
80,000. That single statistic tells you so much about the scale of the intervention, the
Yeah.
attempt to reshape not just the landscape, but the very ecology and the culture connected to it.
And it's important to remember, this wasn't just happening in India. This pattern of defining local land use as misuse to justify takeover was happening across the colonial world.
Exactly. It was a standard part of the colonial playbook.
Mm.
Think about Australia, where white settlers used the legal concept of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, to essentially pretend the continent was empty and ignore Aboriginal land rights.
Right.
Or you look at someone like Richard Harding, writing about Honduras in 1896. He described the Central Americans there as semi-barbarians because, in his view, they didn't understand the commercial value of their forests.
So the narrative was always the same. The
Yeah.
local people don't know how to use the land productively, meaning for the colonizers' profit, therefore we have the right to take it and manage it properly.
Precisely. It justified the seizure, the displacement, the entire restructuring of the environment to serve the needs of the metropolitan economy.
Okay, so faced with this level of systematic destruction and, frankly, dehumanization, it's no surprise that people fought back. Let's dive into some of those stories of resistance, starting with the Bastar Rebellion in central India, what's now Chhattisgarh.
Bastar is a really powerful example of organized resistance. You see, the people there already had their own sophisticated ways of managing the forest. They had systems for villages, sharing resources, sometimes paying small fees like devsari or dand if they needed wood from another village's traditional area. They understood forest management long before the forest department showed up.
So they had their own rules, their own sustainable practices. What was the specific trigger then, the thing that pushed them into open rebellion against the colonial administration?
It was a proposal, around 1905, to reserve almost two-thirds of the entire forest area, and alongside that, to completely ban shifting cultivation, hunting, and the collection of forest produce, even in the areas that weren't reserved. It was an existential threat.
Just a complete clampdown. And who took the lead in organizing the fight back?
The initiative primarily came from the Durwa community of the Kangar Forest, and what's really fascinating is how they mobilized support across different villages. They didn't send written notices or anything like that.
No letters?
No, they used potent local symbols. Messages were passed from village to village, using things like a mango bough, a lump of earth, some chilies, and an arrow. These were instantly understood as a call to arms, an invitation to join the uprising.
Wow, a kind of symbolic language of rebellion. That's incredible. So what happened? How did the Bastar Rebellion end?
Well, like many such uprisings, it was eventually suppressed quite brutally by the British forces. They sent in troops, villages were burned, leaders were punished. However, the rebellion wasn't entirely in vain.
They achieved something.
They did. The sheer scale and organization of the resistance forced the colonial government to backtrack, at least partially. Work on reserving the forests was temporarily suspended, and when it did resume later, the area planned for reservation was reduced by almost half. It was a significant tactical victory born from their defiance.
And the memory of that resistance persisted locally, didn't it? I read something about the leader.
Ah, yes, Gundadur. Local stories and folklore say that during the final battles, he wasn't captured because he had flying powers and simply flew away. It's a way of preserving the spirit of defiance, isn't it? Ensuring the leader escapes, that the resistance, in a way, lives on.
A powerful narrative. Okay, let's shift focus now across the Indian Ocean to Indonesia, specifically Java, which was under Dutch colonial rule. Did similar patterns play out there?
Very similar patterns, yes. The Dutch were keenly interested in Java's rich teak forests, teak being extremely valuable timber. And just like the British in India, they needed to control the labor required to cut and transport this timber.
And was there a specific community central to this, like the forest communities in India?
Yes, the Kalangs. They were traditionally renowned as highly skilled forest cutters and also practiced shifting cultivation. Their skills were considered indispensable for harvesting teak.
So the Dutch needed their labor. Did they also implement a system of sort of forced contribution?
They did. It was known as the Blandon-Beenston system. Under this, villagers, particularly the Kalangs initially, were forced to provide labor-cutting timber and also their buffaloes for dragging the logs out of the forest.
For free.
Well, in return, they were sometimes exempted from paying taxes or rent on their land. But effectively, yes, it was a system of forced labor designed to extract the teak as efficiently as possible for the Dutch state. The scale was huge in just 1 year. 1882, they exported around 280,000 sleepers from Java alone.
Just like India. But did this control also spark resistance in Java? Did people challenge the Dutch system?
Yes, and in a very interesting philosophical way. Around 1890, a movement began, associated with a man named Sarantiko Salmon.
The Salmonist movement.
That's right. Salmon began to openly question the very idea of state ownership of the forest. His argument was beautifully simple but profoundly radical for the time. He basically said, the state didn't create the wind, the water, the earth, or the wood. So how can it claim to own them?
That cuts right to the heart of the colonial claim, doesn't it? Challenging the legitimacy of ownership itself.
Exactly. It was a fundamental rejection of the colonial premise that land and resources could simply be declared state property by an external power. Many Salmonists protested by lying down on their land when the Dutch came to survey it, or refusing to pay taxes or perform labor.
And then fast forward a few decades to World War II, the situation in Java changes dramatically again with the Japanese invasion. What happened to the forests then?
This is where the ultimate irony, perhaps, of the colonial resource focus comes in. As the Japanese advanced, the Dutch, facing defeat, implemented a scorched earth policy.
Scorched earth, meaning?
Meaning they deliberately destroyed resources to prevent the enemy from getting them. In Java, this involved the Dutch burning huge stockpiles of harvested teak logs and destroying sawmills. The very teak they had spent decades systematically extracting and controlling, they now destroyed themselves.
Wow. So the resource was only valuable when they controlled it. The moment they lost control, it became expendable.
Precisely. It highlights how the value was tied entirely to colonial control and profit, not to any intrinsic ecological or even long-term economic worth. So, when you connect these threads, the Baigas petitioning because they're starving, the Durwas mobilizing with mango boughs, the Salmonists questioning the nature of ownership, the Dutch burning their own teak, what does it all really tell us? I think it shows that understanding these histories, the environmental costs, the cultural disruption, the displacement involved in colonial forestry is absolutely essential. It reveals how the modern world was built in part by defining progress not through ecological health, but through profitable, often destructive simplification. And we're arguably still dealing with the consequences of that narrow definition.
That's a powerful synthesis. But there has been some shift in thinking more recently, hasn't there? A recognition that maybe the old ways weren't entirely wrong?
Yes, thankfully. Since around the 1980s, there's been a growing realization, particularly in governments across Asia and Africa, that effective forest conservation actually needs the involvement of local communities. The top-down state control model often failed ecologically and socially.
So a move towards acknowledging that the people who live closest to the forest might actually know something about how to look after it.
It's a crucial shift. It's starting to recognize that the very communities displaced and disregarded might hold vital knowledge for long-term sustainability knowledge the colonial systems actively try to erase.
And that brings us to a really hopeful final point. Despite everything, the laws, the plantations, the forest changes, some indigenous conservation practices actually survived, didn't they? These pockets of protected forest maintained by villages themselves.
Absolutely. Even today, you can find these incredible sacred groves across India and other parts of Asia and Africa. They have local names like Sarnas, Devarkudu, Khan, Rai. These are often dense, biodiverse patches of forest that have been protected for generations purely through community effort and belief, often linked to local deities or ancestral spirits.
They survived outside the state system.
They did. They represent a living legacy of a different way of relating to the forest.
So the knowledge wasn't lost. It was just sidelined. Made illegal. Which leaves us with a final thought, really. The whole project of modernization we've discussed was built on systematically extracting resources and dismissing the deep place-based knowledge of communities deemed unproductive. If that foundation ignored so much wisdom then, what crucial knowledge, what other ways of knowing and living might we still be overlooking or dismissing today in our pursuit of progress?